So we're here with John Nucci, Vice President for Government Relations at Suffolk University. After a long and interesting career in Boston politics, city councilor, chairman of the school committee, clerk of the court. So what took you into Boston politics?
I'm not sure exactly what it was that brought me into politics. I don't think I grew up trying to be or wanting to be a politician. But what was a factor for me was that back in 1983, the city changed its charter. And it went from an all at-large or citywide group of elected officials and school committee members to a system where you could get elected from your neighborhood, somewhat expanded beyond the definition of your neighborhood. So it went from 9 members of the city council elected at large and 5 members of the school committee elected at large to 13 members, 9 districts and 4 at large.
In both the city council and
the city council and the school committee, which and you know, strangely enough, that formula works pretty good for the city council, but it didn't work for the school committee because there was no relevance between the schools and the districts. It was, I really think those who brought the city to district representation said, okay, now that we've done the city council, let's just apply it to the school committee.
Right.
But anyway, I decided that now that there was a chance, you know, as just a kid from East Boston who had no political family, had no political ties, I would not have been able to get elected citywide. But I decided to run in my first election from District 1, which is my neighborhood of East Boston, North End in Charlestown, and I was successful. I had an interest in public education, having spent 20 years at Action for Boston Community Development, the city's anti-poverty agency, which focused a lot on educational programs. So I brought that to the position. My wife is a Boston Public Schools teacher of 39 years. So, you know, and I've always tried to value education with my kids. So I had that interest in education. So suddenly I found myself on the Boston School Committee. And after 1 year in the school committee, my colleagues elected me president of the school committee at the tender age of 32 years old. And it was, you know, probably the most challenging experience I've ever had. Probably the best learning experience I've ever had. I just learned all kinds of skills ranging from dealing with the media to public policy to education to managing a group of colleagues and building consensus. And I think that experience was great and served me well in future positions. You know, I think that after I did 6 years on the Boston School Committee, 4 years as president, you know, when you get into politics in Boston, usually, once you're in, you just start climbing the ladder. For most people, not all. You start climbing, or at least you aspire to climb the ladder. And in 1989, there were 4 solid incumbents on the city council in the at-large positions, but I decided to run. And that was a very interesting election in 1989. The 4 incumbents were very tough to beat, I found out. In the preliminary election, even though I had enormous name recognition having been president of the Boston School Committee, I finished behind by about 6,000 votes in the preliminary election. My campaign woke up, and in the general election in November, we were declared the winner in 1989. I got a call from the election commissioner at 10 o'clock at night saying I had won. We had our victory party. I was interviewed by Channel 5. And at about 1 o'clock in the morning, I got a call from the election department saying there was an error in tabulating the votes. So I tasted both victory and defeat in the same evening. And I came back 2 years later and won a seat on the Boston City Council. So it was interesting times.
An at-large seat.
I won an at-large seat on the Boston City Council 2 years later in 1991. That's right.
And one of the big challenges when you were still president of the school committee, this is the end of the court's control of the schools.
My first year as president, you know, I sat down with my colleagues on the school committee, and I said, let's decide one thing we want to do, you know, as a school committee this year and in the next couple of years. And that one thing became convincing Judge Arthur Garrity to disengage from the Boston Public Schools. I felt very strongly with leaders like Ray Flynn serving as mayor, with a school committee that was more diverse and more progressive than any other school committee had been, with a city council that was more diverse and progressive, that the time had perhaps come for the federal district court to have confidence that no city leaders would consciously resegregate the schools ever again. And that was the essence of the argument I wanted to bring to the federal district court. And that's what I did. I spent that whole first year down at the federal district court almost every day. And we got to the point where in 1985, Judge Garrity issued his first set of final orders. They're called Morgan v. Nucci. And basically what he said in those orders, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said that the leadership of Ray Flynn, members of the city council, and myself as school committee president has restored his confidence to the point where he did not envision city leaders consciously segregating the schools again. That didn't mean we were going to go running back to neighborhood schools, which we didn't and couldn't do and shouldn't have done. But it did mean that we were able to put into place the first sort of variation from the busing way of assigning students. And I think it was called the controlled choice plan. And it increased the likelihood that you would get a school you choose, but didn't guarantee it. And even today, it's not guaranteed. The reality is you can't go back to a neighborhood schools system when some neighborhoods don't have schools.
Yeah.
You just can't do that. And I would also add that there was and continues to be, I think, a misunderstanding among many about what the busing case was all about. It was not about a federal judge sort of overnight deciding that black children should sit next to white children in school. That's not what it was. And I think, over time people see it that way, that somehow there was this misguided policy of requiring black children to sit next to white children in school. That was not it. The reality is, when it began, there were schools in the black neighborhoods that were full of black students. There were schools in the white neighborhoods full of white students. Nothing inherently wrong with that. That's where they lived. What was wrong was that those schools in the black neighborhoods were not getting the same resources. They were not getting the good teachers. They were not getting the good books. They were not getting their buildings fixed and their windows fixed when they broke. Yet they were in the other neighborhoods. So that's how it started. And really, Judge Garrity got to the point where he became very frustrated with city leaders at the time who would not respond to that, and said, well, then I guess the only way I can guarantee equity of resources is to make sure everyone's in the same school buildings. Very simple premise. Now, the remedy caused lots of problems. There's no question about it. I mean, those that say that the remedy that he put forward damaged the Boston public schools are absolutely correct. But the need for action there's no argument. There had to be some action.
Now, was the move back to district representation also a move against the old school committee? I mean, the way it was a citywide school committee?
Yeah, the district representation in hindsight probably should not have been applied to the school committee. It works for the city council because what was done was that the city was broken up into contiguous neighborhoods and these 9 district seats were created. It made sense. It allowed people who otherwise would not have had access to elected office to have that access. You could run without high name recognition. You could run for office without a lot of money. You had a choice among your neighbors, you had a chance, I should say, among your neighbors of getting elected. But as an afterthought, they applied it to the school committee. And there's no relevance, there's no relationship between the districts and the schools. For example, one district consists of Beacon Hill, Back Bay. There are no children in the schools in Beacon Hill, Back Bay. Another district consists of Mattapan, Roxbury. Well, a lot of children in the schools are in that neighborhood. Yet, the voice was the same for each school committee member, and that didn't make sense. It also turned the school committee, which is supposed to be a policy-making body, into a 13-member body. Too large, too unmanageable. And I think there was a growing pain period for the school committee, not quite understanding what their role should be. Some school committees, meaning well-intended, came to the school committee thinking that they were sort of city councilors in charge of the school, and understanding the city councilors did constituent service. So they should do constituent service. But when you're a policy-making body, you can't get yourself involved in the details of management. And I think in an attempt to fulfill those constituent requests, school committee members were doing that. They didn't mean harm, but that's just was their perception of the role. So it didn't work. It was not helpful for the school committee. I think it's worked well for the city council, with one exception that I would add. I think that It didn't create the competition in the districts that it intended to.
Right.
Ironically, it created a competition in the at-large races, where every 2 years there's a race for at-large city council, yet the district councils go basically unopposed because they're able to do constituent services and build sort of power within their neighborhood. So it kind of didn't accomplish that.
Now, a more cynical person might look at the school department and say, it's a huge bureaucracy. And if you're on the school committee, you have the opportunity to get your brother a job here, get your cousin a job here. Is that kind of patronage part of
I think it did at one time. I think it was true. In the late 80s, I formed a partnership with the Boston Municipal Research Bureau and Sam Tyler, who heads the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, and still heads the Boston Municipal Research Bureau, to develop a home rule petition. And we developed a home rule petition successfully in partnership with the business community that statutorily took the school committee out of the hiring process, so that it is now in statute that only the superintendent can hire and fire. And I'll tell you why I did that. I did that because at my very first school committee meeting, I sat down and there were a pile of folders in front of me on the dais of the school committee. And I had no idea what I was supposed to do with these folders. So I asked the superintendent, what are all these folders? He said, oh, those are appointments that you have to approve as a school committee tonight. And it was for lunch mothers and bus drivers and teachers and teachers' aides. And my first reaction was, why is the school committee approving these hires? We hire one person, that's the superintendent, and you do all the rest of the hiring. To accomplish that, we had to change the law, and we did change the law. So I don't think it exists at the level that it used to. It clearly used to. It really doesn't exist there anymore. And I think the school system has become far more complex, requiring certain skills and certain talents that you just can't hire a brother-in-law or a daughter-in-law to these positions. They require a certain level of training and education. So I don't think, anecdotally does it exist, I suppose, but not as a pattern.
And then there's the move to an appointed school committee.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that. I initially opposed the effort. I said that, look, the issue is not whether it's elected or appointed. The problem is the size and the structure, and I still believe that. I don't think that was a problem. I think there's some good that's come out of the appointed school committee. Most notably, we tend to keep superintendents a little bit longer with the appointed. That's a double-edged sword, though. I think part of the rationale for superintendents staying longer is that their job is easier. And their job is easier because there's not much pushback from the school committee, or at least there hasn't been. I think not too long ago, somebody did a survey of school committee votes, and they were all unanimous. And it's impossible. They can't be unanimous. So I think that while it brought some stability, it kept superintendents around a little bit longer, it took parents and the consumers of the school system out of the process. For better or worse, parents knew where to go when they had a problem. And if they weren't getting answers from the school department, which, as you say, is a big bureaucracy, not always sensitive to what they're talking about, they'd come to the school committee, and it'd be action. They lost that. Yeah. They lost their voice. Is that the ones who are complaining that they don't have a right to vote for school committee members are the minority communities. And they're the ones that have the biggest stake in the Boston Public Schools. So there's something amiss if the biggest bunch of consumers that deal with the Boston Public Schools aren't happy with the governance structure. And I think we have to pay attention to that. Not necessarily advocating a return to an elected school committee, but something's wrong when the largest group of consumers are complaining about governance. I think you just at least have to listen and understand that.
Yeah. And you can kind of see at the same time that the minority community in Boston was growing in the 1950s, where you do away with district representation.
That's right.
Meaning by the 1960s, city council and school committee are entirely white.
That's right.
So yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think that was, as I mentioned earlier, that's part of the reason why, we don't have a federal district court involved, because later, as it became larger and more diverse, it was clearly more sensitive to minority parents and the concerns around segregating schools.
Yeah. So you were elected to the school committee the same year Ray Flynn was elected.
That's right.
mayor.
That's right.
And so he was seeing one of the big problems in the city was the racial polarization. That was also a problem you saw in the school.
Yeah, no question about it. I will say that Ray Flynn's legacy to me is race relations. I'm not sure we've had a leader in this city who made it such a priority. He really did make race relations a priority. He also paid close attention to the Boston Public Schools, which up until then, you didn't see much from mayors. The schools were sort of the orphan of city government. No mayor wanted to take accountability and responsibility for the schools. Ray took it on, and one of his first official actions was to appoint a liaison to the school committee. It was Bob Consalvo, who was his education advisor, and he was appointed to be a liaison to the school committee. That seems insignificant, but it's huge. It was a huge statement that there's a mayor that's going to take responsibility and accountability for the schools to a degree that you really hadn't had before. Now, of course, today, with the appointed school committee, the mayor has accountability and responsibility. For all intents and purposes, the appointed school committee is really an advisory board to the mayor. So the mayor has total accountability and responsibility for the schools. But back then, mayors didn't do that. And yes, the racial issues of the city, inevitably spilled into policy making at the school department. There's no question about it. We had a system that was moving rapidly towards majority-minority, and there are adjustments and that have to go with that. And, I think, generally speaking, once we got to the 80s, it was dealt with more sensitively and more intelligently. Obviously, the early 70s was a totally different approach to dealing with it, and not a terribly kind one.
Yeah, it was a bad time for the city.
Yeah.
Now, Boston has a lot of similar problems to other cities, but we haven't seen Boston go the way of Detroit, Cleveland, Hartford, other cities that are beset by crime, fleeing population. How do you account for Boston's
A couple of reasons. And I'll give credit to the business community for that. In Boston, thanks in large part to the mayors and the leaders of the business community, there's been a partnership. There's been an alliance between the business community and city government. And when that happens, there's a certain strength that comes out of that I think keeps total collapse at bay. Because you've got the leaders of the business community and the policymakers of the city working together. So I think that's one good reason for it. The other reason is that during the Tom Menino years, he put a huge priority on fiscal management. There probably hasn't been a mayor that paid such close attention to the budget and the financial management and the bond ratings and how this city sat financially. That had a lot to do with this city avoiding collapse. We also have something that those other cities don't have that keeps us in pretty good shape, and that's certainly what we call the meds and the eds, the medical institutions and the educational institutions. We have universities and colleges and hospitals that, while people say they're tax exempt and they're not contributing to the city, without them, we would be Detroit. They are our industry. They're the industry we have in Boston. Detroit lost the auto industry. If we lost the universities and hospitals, we'd be Detroit. So they're a source of employment. They're a source of economic vitality. They're a big reason why so many people come into Boston every day to work. Boston's population doubles between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. every single day. And eds and meds are a reason for that.
Another thing, it occurs to me, you've talked about Ray Flynn, Tom Menino. Boston's able to attract good people into public service. How is that? And what is the...
I think that's wasn't always the case in Boston. I think that in Boston, I'll go back to the sort of university community and the business community. There's a demand for good people. The business community in Boston cares about who's holding office. That's not true in all cities.
No.
They don't see the connection. Many cities don't see the intersection between government and the business community as being important. This city does, so I think there's a lot of attention paid by the business community, the university communities, by the media on local politics. Not as much as they used to, because the media world is changing and they don't have the resources to cover city council meetings and school committee meetings. Every single school committee meeting that I had, there were 3 TV stations and 3 or 4 newspapers there. there were 3 newspapers who had offices in the school committee building, had bureaus there, so you just don't see that anymore. But in terms of the overall picture of the type of people going into politics, I just think that there's a demand for quality when you put the business community, university community, the people who think in the city into one room. They put a premium on attracting quality people. The other reason perhaps is that there's perhaps maybe a better career track in Boston if you go into public life than there is in other cities, because you could wind up at a university, for example. And I think it's sort of a learning, training ground for people to do other things, not just in the public sector, but in the nonprofit and private sector.
Is there anything else we should ask over here? Any other things you'd like to talk about?
How is it, could you comment on the health of political journalism here in Boston?
Sure.
Because you, of course, are very deeply involved in that.
Yeah,
And
I'm
it's
one of them
exciting.
now, huh?
It's
Yeah.
exciting.
You provide political
Yeah,
journalism.
it's gotten a lot better since
That's
that guy
right, yeah,
Nucci
yeah.
started writing for the Sure, I'll be happy to. I think that coverage of politics in the city and coverage of government in the city is not at the level it used to be. So in that sense, it's unfortunate. They don't have the resources, they don't have the time, they don't have the space to really devote a lot of attention to what goes on in local government. You go to some small towns and with their small local papers, and that's all you see is coverage of local government. But yet you can open the Globe and the Herald on any given day and not see any coverage of city politics. So I think it's unfortunate they don't have the resources. I think the quality, however, has probably improved. The Globe, the Herald, the TV stations I won't even talk about because they don't cover local politics at all. I think the Globe and the Herald, when they do pay attention, they pay thoughtful attention, and I think the quality of the journalism, the quality of the writing and the reporting is good. I'll give lots of credit to the Boston Globe for the investigative work that they do. I think that holds public officials' feet to the ground, makes them accountable. The fact that there are investigative units out there looking for corruption and going after corruption, as long as it's done fairly, then I think that can be a good thing. And both papers do that, not just the Globe. So I think the fact that there is an investigative arm or investigative piece of the local media is probably healthy. So all in all, I think it's unfortunate they don't do as much, but what they do has probably improved the quality.